are you working from a clean surface? Because if you're assembling in an area that hasn't been properly sanitized, what good are you doing assembling in a supposedly clean area? So you can use it to check your prep station. Is that clean? Is your sink being cleaned at the end of the day so that you don't just end up with a biofilm buildup on it?
Rising above the buzz of ultrasonic cleaners and the clanking of stainless steel are the ideas and voices that are changing an industry. You're listening to the Beyond Clean podcast, the central nexus for the people, processes, and products that are improving our sterile processing world. Each week, we speak with frontline technicians, CEOs, engineers, and entrepreneurs with a common goal: to help you fight dirty, every instrument, every time. Whether you're tuning in for education or inspiration, we're glad you did. Now turn on those washers and turn up the volume. It's time to go beyond clean.
This week we are talking with Rory Burke about cleaning verification tests. And particularly as we're going to talk to Rory, he's passionate about those protein residue tests. And this episode titled Still Sticking Around, Thinking Through Residual Protein. This is going to be an important discussion for consumables that you should have in your sterile processing department, because protein residues, they've got a real impact on patient safety. So this will be a fun one. Buckle up, because we might be ruffling some feathers out there for departments that maybe think that protein testing isn't all that necessary. You've got me here today. Hank Balch is out there on the front lines fighting dirty and educating at some conferences. So if you came for the show horse, you're left with the stable pony, I suppose, today. But tune in, because this is going to be a good one. I'm Bobby Parker.
And I'm Hank Balch.
From the studios of Healthcare HQ, you're listening to Beyond Clean, the global voice of sterile processing.
And joining us now is Rory Burke, lead medical supply technician at Fort Harrison VA Medical Center. Rory, thanks for joining us on the show.
Thanks for having me here, Bobby. Happy to have this opportunity to share experience and hopefully teach some people some stuff.
Well, that's what it's all about. And Rory, I'm excited to be chatting with you today about protein residue testing, and particularly how that has been a part of your story at the VA Medical Center there and why it's so important. So for our listeners out there who are hearing Rory on the show here, who have been astutely tuned in to Beyond Clean, they might remember that you've had a couple of panel discussions with us here recently in July and August, but I think this is your first time with us on the podcast. Is that right?
Yes, it is. And I'm really excited to have the opportunity. Thanks to Beyond Clean for giving me this platform to work with.
For sure. Well, we've talked about protein testing a number of times on Beyond Clean. If you go back, I think maybe season 8 was the last time we talked about the science of protein testing. I don't know that we've come at it from the perspective of a user, which is why we're excited to talk to you particularly today, Rory, because you've been on the front lines working with protein testing. And so I want to get into a lot about what goes into that thought process of why we pick one test over another, what we protein test, what we don't, and how that impacts the overall workflow. But hey, before I get too far ahead of myself, Rory, why don't you kick us off in this conversation and tell us a little bit about yourself, maybe what your role looks like in the day-to-day basis, and then particularly what role you have in this protein residue testing in the department on a day-to-day basis.
Sure thing. So a little background on myself. I spent 7 years in the Navy as a hospital corpsman before I joined the sterile processing field with the Montana VA system. And just to quickly cover my bases here, even though I work for the VA, my views I'm expressing today do not represent VA Montana, the Department of Veterans Affairs, or the federal government. They are my own. But within my department, I'm our instrument tracking system coordinator, so I manage a lot of our inventory. But as a lead technician, I'm also still working on the floor, cleaning instruments, sterilizing instruments, high-level disinfection, doing all of that. And up until a couple years ago, we were using ATP testing. Like, I think most hospitals were at the time. And I started seeing more and more research come out about how, while that's great for food grade, it might not be the best for medical situations, and started doing some digging into articles and found that residual proteins were starting to be more and more of an industry standard for testing. Got talking with my leadership, had some good discussions with them, and end of the day we decided to change directions, and we haven't really looked back since.
Okay. And Rory, you and I have had this discussion a couple of times about the difference between protein testing and ATP testing. And again, we have some episodes on that really break down the science and the difference between those two. But why don't you break down in layman's terms what the difference is really between that protein test and the ATP test, and why at your facility, the protein test made sense?
So the main difference between ATP testing, which is, I believe, adenosine triphosphate, versus just residual protein testing, is ATP testing looks for live strains only of that strand, whereas a residual protein test is chemically designed to test for both living and dead across a broad spectrum of proteins. So rather than focusing on something that hopefully was already killed by your enzymatic, I can pick up if there's even just neutralized bioburden still present. If there's still organic gunk, even if it's dead, it could be a problem down the line. So that was our main reason for changing directions, as well as just the industry standards for ATP weren't as well defined as they are protein testings as to what the high mark was. Ours was 10%. At my hospital, we were looking at 10% of what the Endoscopic Nursing Association said was a safe level, but with the protein testing, there's a clearly established standard that everybody seems happy to stick with.
Okay, well, I definitely want to dive in a little bit to that standards and guidelines discussion. But before we get there, I want to keep hitting this introductory definition and welcome, because I don't know, I like to think about it when we introduce people to a new topic. Like, could we explain this to aliens who haven't set foot in the department? And so I appreciate that breakdown between the ATP and the proteins. And like you said, that ATP is looking at the energy source of living organisms. And so our washing process, particularly with that thermal disinfection, may give a clean result on the clean side because the ATP isn't present in what remains on that instrument. But to your point, there might be residual proteins there that could still be detected. So that is definitely consideration as you're thinking about the two. But the one more thing that I wanted you to press in on is, what are we using these protein tests for? I mean, we've said the word sterile processing and washer disinfector at this point, but what are we doing with protein tests and why? Why is that important?
So the main use in my department for protein testing is any endoscopic devices that come down, lumen devices. We'll both test residuals on the outside as well as within the lumen to make sure we've effectively brushed and neutralized anything within that lumen. But we'll also use them if there's any question about, are we being effective in cleaning our flat surfaces at the end of the day? Or is that bioburden or not? We've got swabs, and we'll just swab a flat surface if we need to and do a quick test, see, are we being effective in even just our disinfection process of our own workspace?
That makes sense. And I know that different departments use these cleaning verification tests in various amounts and at various times. And so I'm curious, Rory, in your experience there at the VA, have they always been used while you were there? Or did you go through any kind of transition? What's your story with the cleaning tests been like?
So the 4 years I've been with the VA, we always had some sort of verification. Like you said, we started off with the ATP tests, but the whole time it's been considered mandatory that we do 100% testing with all our endoscopic devices, be they EGDs, colonoscopes, cystoscopes, or ureteroscopes. I know that's stricter than Amy's standard, but for us, we feel strongly about keeping it as tight as possible, so we do 100% validation.
No, that's awesome. And I don't know, I feel the same way in my gut about how often we should be using cleaning verification tests and doing that good visual inspection. I saw one department that had a station set up in their endoscope cleaning room after the manual sinks and before their automated disinfector that they called their safety stop section or their timeout station for their scope, similar to how you would in surgery where everybody calls timeout to make sure that everything's proceeding safely. We've got the right patient, right surgical site, right people in the room. They would do the same thing with scopes. They carved out enough labor time to be able to stop with every scope before it goes into the disinfector to get a borescope on it, get the lighted magnification on the distal end of it, do their manual cleaning verification test there. And then when all of that was good, they would move it on. And certainly that's above what's required and is certainly maybe a challenge to make it happen with the labor that we have available, but certainly would be a great thing to have that level of confidence about every scope that you put in. The reason that I asked about what your story has been with cleaning verification tests there at the VA is I know that the recommendations to move to this cleaning verification test are not all that old. It's somewhat of a new recommendation. And so there's a lot of facilities out there that are either just now adopting this as a practice or maybe still haven't made that change yet. And so I'm curious, what do you think are some of the benefits that a department is going to find whenever they decide to move from no cleaning verification test to all of a sudden now they've got them in the department? What are some of the pluses and benefits of using them?
I'd say, an obvious one is it gives you a peace of mind. Because rather than going, well, I did all the steps and I think this is clean, you have a physical proof you can hold in your hand that I did clean this. And it also is going to increase, hopefully there's not too many happening, but it's going to increase positive patient outcomes because you're going to be catching those issues by having that safety station, like you called it, set up, doing these cleaning validations. I actually just saw Ofsted and Associates just released a study showing that there's been a big spike in that sort of infection recently. So having cleaning verifications, it's not only better for the patient, better for your own peace of mind, it's going to protect your department because you can say we have done everything we can and help break down, okay, where's the failure point if there is a failure point. It's just one more thing to look at on that failure point, I'd say.
Yeah, it feels kind of silly asking the question, what are the benefits you're going to get when you actually follow best practices? And so I appreciate you giving me back that obvious answer, that obvious question. But in addition to just doing the right thing and being safe and protecting your organization from risk and protecting your patients from harm, you also, as you mentioned there at the end of your answer, you get some operational gains maybe or some quality management gains because you now go from having this subjective idea about what is clean and what is dirty to now you have something that's definitive, that's verifiable, that can be measured. And so as you're using that, particularly directly after a cleaning process, you're getting information about this particular scope. And you're also getting information about how it's been cleaned and maybe some performance metrics about how your cleaning process looks at the sink might uncover some opportunities for training and improvement. And so I loved what you said right at the beginning of the episode of you use these things to figure out is this bioburden? Is that thing clean? Having a cleaning residue test can actually start to answer that question for you of what is this thing that I'm looking at? Or is this scope that I think is clean? Is it verifiably, documentably clean? And so, yeah, super useful. Before we move into the guidelines and standards bit of our discussion, because I want to get into that. I know it's not entirely agreed upon and widely adopted on standards just yet. But before we get into that, there are a couple of other uses for our cleaning verification tests because some of our listeners may be in one of those sterile processing departments where they don't have the responsibility for the big GI scopes that we've been talking about or even any flexible scopes. So is there a place for a protein residue test in, say, a sterile processing department that just sees stainless steel surgical instruments?
Oh, absolutely. Because, you're still going to be looking, especially on your prep side, but both prep and decon areas, are your prep surfaces being cleaned correctly, whether that's you guys or your own team or environmental services cleaning that. are you working from a clean surface? Because if you're assembling in an area that hasn't been properly sanitized, what good are you doing assembling in a supposedly clean area? So you can use it to check your prep station. Is that clean? Is your sink being cleaned at the end of the day so that you don't just end up with a biofilm buildup on it? And instruments, you can even just spot test check your stainless steel. The swabs can get down in the lock, in the hinge, in the box lock, get into those tricky places and make sure there's nothing hiding down there.
Yeah, and as we're talking about protein residue testing, that's really what comes to mind for me, is those nooks and crannies that are really hard to get some friction on, or it's hard to get open so that your washer can get that spray impingement on and get that cleaning activity going. What residual proteins might be hanging out in those box locks or in the grooves of that spiral flexible hip reamer, or even hanging out in the channels of our flexible endoscopes? And so that is a great idea. When it comes to how do you manage testing it, you might ask the question like, well, shoot, if this is a good idea, why not do it on every instrument that passes through every technician's hand every time? And I don't know. That's a good question and challenge. What are some of the challenges that you've encountered with that model of testing every instrument every time?
I think the biggest challenge you face at that point is just, it's not a lot of time, but the test that we use at least takes 30 seconds to result. And if you're testing every instrument every time, you're going to start royally slowing down your process just waiting for those to result. Plus, you're running up a bill on your testing supplies if you're burning through a swab on every instrument. Because even at my small facility, I might handle 400 to 600 instruments a day pretty easily, just myself, not my entire team. We're handling a couple thousand instruments in a day. So both supply and time are going to be big factors on that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And obviously always follow your manufacturer's instructions when you're working with a test. But a lot of these tests require the device to be cleaned after it's been tested because it's being swabbed with the sampling or testing solution, right? And so to have to clean everything twice because you tested everything, it's kind of untenable. At this place, it probably makes more sense to be setting up some kind of quality maintenance schedule where you're every now and then testing some sample instruments, and rather than every instrument every time. So as we're thinking about the guidelines and recommendations out there for best practices about how to use protein tests, Rory, can you tell us a little bit about what is out there and what requirements there might be, particularly to help out our users who maybe haven't yet dipped their toe into the sea of protein testing and just cleaning verification tests in general?
Yeah, so the main guideline on it at this point, the newer version of the ST91 did a good job of clarifying some things that I think were a little vague in the older version, that high-risk scopes must be tested for cleaning verification, and moderate-risk scopes should be tested for cleaning verification, which I think anytime Amy decides to take the time to say something should, you probably should just interpret that as a must, because eventually it's going to turn into one. And they don't specify the type, but like I said, the guidelines are a little bit better laid down. The American Journal of Infection Control set a benchmark for protein testing at 6.4 micrograms per square centimeter of residual proteins, whereas for ATP it's between 0.43 and 0.81 bioluminescence, which that's a pretty broad range. The proteins just have a much better defined point of where it becomes problematic.
No, that's perfect. And thanks for clarifying that for us. I know that there has been some, maybe, I don't want to call it disagreement, but some concerns maybe about the interpretation and the application of that ST91 document. But I appreciate you bringing out that they've broken the scopes into different tiers, those high risk scopes. And you'll actually find the list of the types of scopes in that ST91 document. Those high risk scopes, it calls out that this shall be done. And then for the other scopes that maybe don't fall into that high risk category, it's still a good idea. It's still best practice. And maybe you could find a statistically significant frequency to be doing that, but it's not a shall do it every time. And as we referenced earlier, Rory, where is the place in the workflow that testing should take place? Is this, before you clean it, during, after it's been disinfected? When should departments be using it?
You should be doing this after the manual cleaning has been completed or automated if you have a scope flushing system of some sort. I know there's a few different options on the market for that sort of thing. But once the cleaning's been completed, but before you go into high-level disinfection or sterilization, because you don't want to be shoving a non-sterile swab down a freshly high-level disinfected lumen, because then you're just going to put it right back in the disinfectant. And good job, you've doubled your work. So after cleaning, but before HLD or sterilization, about the same time you send a borescope down it if you've got the convenience of one on the decon side, or ahead of that if you can only do that on the clean side. Well, it depends on your department's setup.
No, that's perfect. And for our departments out there who are not doing flexible scopes and thinking about, what are my requirements for my stainless steel instruments, I would encourage you to go grab your favorite AMI document, that ST79, and flip all the way to the back to Annex D. There's a good 2 or 3 page section in there just for you on how to pick a cleaning verification test, how frequently to use it, the benefits of doing so, and it's really interesting reading. And so meet those best recommendations, those best practices, and read through that annex in the back of the document. All right, Rory. So maybe at this point we've convinced our listeners that if they're not currently doing protein residue testing on their endoscopes or on their surgical instruments, that it would be a good idea in doing so. So help situate us in the mind of the SPD manager who's now motivated to get this implemented in the department. What would be some of those first steps or considerations that they would need to take into place before they just start ordering a bunch of supplies?
So I'd say big considerations. Obviously, you're going to want to do your research on the various options out there because there's multiple rapid reads as well as some slower result ones, which are going to be more accurate, but they also might take half an hour, 4 hours, and you don't really want that if you're trying to do high volume turnaround. It's just going to be an easier to interpret one, most likely. So do your research. Don't just jump at the first company you see. Do your research. Figure out which one is best going to fit the pace you need to mate. Make sure you have the storage. I know for ours, the reagent for testing has to be refrigerated. So make sure you've got the storage for all the new supplies you're going to be getting. Reach out to the company. See if you can't get an in-service on it when you first get the supplies in. Get your educator on board so that you can sit down, make sure everybody knows this is going to be a new part of our process. Make sure you have documentation. We have it on our instrument tracking system. There's a pass-fail documentation for every protein test in the system. But make sure you know how you're going to document. And then make sure the team's aware of the why, because it's a lot easier to accept a new process that's going to interfere with your flow when you understand why you're doing it, why it's important to be doing it, and what the benefits you're going to see are.
That last point that you made, Rory, is so big. Anytime that we're making a process change, right? But particularly one that is going to add minutes to every scope that they have to touch, right? This is a decision that might be in their minds getting in the way of them making it to their lunch on time. And so make sure that this is a discussion that you have with your team. If there's one thing that I know for sure about sterile processing technicians, it's how much they care about the safety of their patients. None of us ended up in this industry for the glory, the fame, or probably the money. We're here because we care about healthcare and we care about patients. And so do your research. Pull up the Ofsted study that Rory talked about and the importance of not having contaminated scopes be a reality at our facility. And more importantly than just giving your best gladiator speech about how we're going to wage war against the microbial contaminants in our scopes and that this is the tool that we need to do it, more than that, as a leader, do what you can to try to carve out the time required to do this step. Nothing is going to be more stressful or frustrating for your sterile processing technicians than being asked to add yet another time-consuming step to their workflow and not being given the appropriate time, where they're having to think of creative shortcuts in order to create the time to get done what they need to get done. So yes, please involve your staff as you're thinking about, how do I implement this and how do I add another quality measure to our workflow? Do we have the time set up for it? Do we have the staffing appropriate? Do we have the number of scopes required to do this safely without causing a tremendous amount of delays and putting pressure on your team members? So all that really useful. Rory, from your experience on a supply perspective, any considerations on an ordering or stocking perspective that would be useful to think through as you're getting started on this?
I mean, the biggest thing is just consider the volume, not just of overall scopes, but of different types of scopes, because, so, like I said, we use it for 4 different types of scopes. So on top of making sure we have enough reagent for the number of scopes we're seeing daily, we're making sure we've got the right balance of swabs for the ultra small lumen of a ureter scope all the way up through that nice wide opening on an EGD. So make sure you're getting a balance of the right supplies for your volume and your types of equipment. And check with the manufacturers of your scopes. Maybe they look in their IFU. They might have some specifications for testing within their own IFU. So
that's a good call out, making sure that you've got a compatible method and that you're doing so appropriately and that you have the supplies stocked and ready to go at the place that it needs to be done. That's the best way to get consistent compliance, is making sure that the tools are at the place and the time is being given for the task. So really important. Last thing I want to talk about before we move to close this discussion here, Rory, is what do you do when you find a failure? Obviously, in an ideal world, we're just demonstrating compliance with these tests and all of them are passing, but inevitably you're going to have one come back that is positive for too many residual proteins. What should a user do in that moment?
If you've got a failure, our policy, at least the one I've always been taught, is that first failure, go straight back to the beginning of your cleaning process. Stinks when you got to do it, but it's the safest thing to do. Go through your whole manual cleaning again. If you get a second failure on that, send the borescope down. Is there something you need to know about? Or maybe that scope's actually damaged and it didn't get picked up on leak test, but there's something acting as a reservoir for bioburn that you're not going to get to with your brushes, and that scope needs to be sent out. So try it again. Try giving it a second cleaning. Maybe something just hung on a little more than you expected it to. You get a second failure, send a scope down, see if you can see what's causing that failure.
And as that starts that investigation process, are you keeping any documentation on these protein residue tests?
Oh, absolutely. For us, we're using our instrument tracking system because it's got its own scope module, and if we've had a scope fail 3 times, we've documented all 3 of those failures, and we actually run monthly reports on what percentage failure we had, both for our own benefit, but we also share those with infection prevention. So if we're having a higher than average month, they'll come down and take a look and go, okay, where's the failure point that's caused this uptick?
Right. Is it a particular scope that keeps having the issue? Is it a model and shape of scope? Is it a particular sink setup, a detergent we're using? Is it always the same technician who cleaned it? Having that kind of data is really valuable. And that's where I was going with that documentation question. Not always important to document just to show that you're compliant with the standards, but to be able to get that usable data on the back end. So that is really good. Thank you for sharing that with us. Rory, as we move to close here, I want to ask kind of the future thinking question. What is it that protein residue testing can't do right now that you wish maybe it would, and are hopeful maybe someday we'll see that get resolved in the future?
I'd say the biggest lack I've seen in protein testing right now is, like I said, you've got slow ones that give a nice, clean, numeric result, but you've got faster ones that give you a result, but it's not as clearly defined. It's still clear enough that you can safely interpret it. I'm not saying otherwise, but it's just not, you don't have a set numbered document. And I'd like to see, I think the next big step is going to be seeing an actual recordable result beyond just pass fail of I had 1.3 micrograms in the scope with that rapid so that we can keep our flow up, but at the same time be giving just solid set in stone numbers, deeper data for better dives, better identification of do we need to tighten industry standards or are we good? Just more data.
Yeah, I appreciate that call out. And manufacturers, you heard it here first. We would love to see a test that is going to be more accurate, give us more data about the scope. And who knows what that looks like? Maybe that's a cleaning verification test that tests for multiple markers. You know, there's a list of 6 or 7 of them that are appropriate cleaning verification tests. Where is our cross marker test out there that will show us the presence of multiple markers on our instrument, the presence of proteins on it or hemoglobin on it or ATP on it, and that could give us in a rapid setting or rapid fashion some numbers that are quickly arrived at. So I appreciate you bringing that up, Rory. Rory, thanks for having this discussion with us. This whole season has been about consumables that you find in the sterile processing department. And we've talked about a number of different ones that we touch every day. And this consumable in particular is one that I wish more sterile processing departments were touching every day. And sometimes it's hard to find a cleaning verification test in their department. So I appreciate your passion about doing every scope every time for your facility and using this as a tool to investigate further whenever there's questions in the department. So Rory, great job, and thanks for coming on the show.
Well, thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it, and I hope there's some techs out there who are going to bring this to their leadership and get those protein tests in and really start locking down their processes.
Absolutely. And we have not gone to the full depths of this topic, particularly in the challenges and workflow considerations that come in the department whenever you set that up. So if you're one of our listeners out there that are considering maybe implementing a cleaning verification test and you want some advice about ATP, protein, or some other method, or just how to get started, I'm sure Rory would love to connect with you on that. Or if you have a question about his experience, I'm sure he'd be happy to answer that. So connect with him there on LinkedIn, on social media, and I'm sure he'd be happy to have that conversation. And that was Rory Burke, lead medical supply technician at Fort Harrison VA Medical Center. It was really good to have Rory on the show here on the podcast. We've been having more conversations with him through the advisory group and those recent webinars, so definitely check him out there. This discussion around protein testing and just general cleaning verification testing at large, I don't think can be understated. It is absolutely important for best practice and for keeping our patients safe. And as I mentioned in the conversation earlier, this is a consumable that I wish that we had in more sterile processing departments. And so if you've got an idea about how to implement cleaning verification tests in a sterile processing department without impacting the workflow too much to maybe make that pill a little bit easier to swallow for more departments, we would love it if you would reach out to us. Send us an email at info@beyondclean.net. And we would be happy to spotlight that conversation and try to share that with the industry because this is so important. So with that, that'll do it for this week's episode. And as we always say here at Beyond Clean, keep fighting dirty.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Beyond Clean. As a reminder, you can help support us by subscribing to Beyond Clean on your favorite podcast app or by downloading the smartphone app on iPhone or Android. Simply search for Beyond Clean in the App Store or Google Play. The best thing about downloading the smartphone app is that you can access bonus content for certain episodes and view episodes in certain categories, like articles on the go and vendor spotlights. Are you following us on LinkedIn or Facebook yet? If you are and you love an episode or post, then let your social network know about it. Like, comment, or share our posts along with your thoughts and keep the conversation going. If you have any topics or guests that you would like to recommend for a future episode, just send us an email to info@beyondclean.net. We look forward to hearing from you.